By sunrise, the family who locked Hannah Ellison outside would learn that the door they closed in the rain was the one that cost them everything. Willow Creek, Montana Territory, 1881, lay under a black spring storm that turned the road to mud and made every oil lamp in the Ellison house glow like a promise meant for someone else. Hannah stood on the front porch with rain running from the brim of her bonnet, her brown calico dress clinging heavy at the hem, both arms wrapped around a worn leather satchel as if it were the last warm thing left in the world. She was 24, white, soft and chubby, with light brown hair pinned loose beneath her bonnet and blue-gray eyes fixed on the door that had once opened for her without question. Behind that door were the table where her mother had rolled biscuit dough, the hearth where Hannah had learned to mend by firelight, the stairs she had climbed as a child counting each creaking board. Tonight, after her mother's burial, the house sounded different. Margaret Ellison's voice moved behind the wood, smooth and cold. Clayton's boots crossed the parlor. A chair scraped. Dishes clinked. Supper was being served while Hannah stood outside in the rain like a mistake no one wished to remember. She lifted one trembling hand and knocked again, not loudly, because pride still lived in her even when shelter did not. The door opened only a crack. Clayton Ellison looked out, his face half-lit by the warm parlor lamp, and tossed her old wool shawl onto the porch floor. "You heard Mother," he said, though Margaret was not Hannah's mother and never had been. "This house is settled now. You have no claim here." Hannah looked past him into the room where yellow light touched polished wood and clean curtains. "Clayton, it is raining." He did not look at the sky. "Then find somewhere dry." The door shut. The lock turned. That small metal sound cut deeper than any shouted word could have, because it was final. Hannah stood still while thunder rolled over the hills. She did not beg again. She could not make herself give them that last piece of her. Instead, she bent slowly, picked up the shawl from the wetboards, and wrapped it around her shoulders, though it held more rain than warmth. Her satchel pressed against her middle, stiff beneath her hands. Inside were a black dress from the funeral, 2 hairpins, her mother's old handkerchief, and a damp seam in the lining she had not yet noticed. If she had opened it then, she would have found the letter hidden there, the one her mother had written for the hour when love failed and blood turned greedy. But Hannah only sank onto the porch step, boots in the mud, the locked door at her back, the storm in front of her, and tried to breathe without letting the house hear her break. Down the lane, hoofbeats slowed. A dark horse came through the rain, its rider half-shadowed beneath a black Stetson and a long wet coat. Wyatt Calder had delivered 2 Maras to the Ellison barn before dusk and ridden away believing the household was grieving, not casting out one of its own. Now he reined in at the gate and saw Hannah on the porch, saw the closed door, the lamp burning inside, the shawl soaked around her shoulders, and the satchel clutched like a heartbeat. He dismounted without hurry, because hurry could frighten a woman who had already been handled by cruelty. He walked to the bottom of the porch steps, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his weathered face unreadable except for the quiet anger tightening his jaw. Hannah looked up, ashamed to be seen and too cold to pretend she was fine. Wyatt did not ask what she had done to deserve it. He looked at the locked door, then back at her, and his voice came low, steady and certain through the storm. "No woman sleeps outside my home." Wyatt Calder did not come up the porch steps as if he had any right to Hannah's fear. He stopped where the rain fell hardest, leaving the 3 wooden steps between them like a promise that he would not take more space than she gave him. Hannah stared at him through the silver sheets of water, one arm locked around her satchel, the other holding the soaked shawl at her throat. The sensible part of her knew she should answer. The colder, wounded part knew that men who spoke kindly in bad weather could still expect payment once the lamps were lit and the doors were closed. Behind her, the Ellison house remained warm and bright, the lock turned, the voices inside lowered as if shutting her out had made her less real. Wyatt removed his long coat and laid it over the porch rail instead of putting it around her shoulders. "That is dry enough inside," he said. "You can take it if you want." Hannah looked at the coat, then at his hands. They were gloved, still, and nowhere near her. That restraint unsettled her more than force would have, because she had no practice defending herself against patience. "I cannot go with you," she said. "You do not know me." "That is true." "Then why did you turn back?" Wyatt glanced toward the closed door. The lamplight behind the curtains flickered as someone moved inside and did not come out. "Because I know what a locked door means in a storm." Hannah swallowed. Rain slipped beneath her collar, cold against her skin. "There is a church in town, 3 miles east. The pastor is away at his sister's farm until Monday." "The boarding house?" "Closed after supper unless Mrs. Hanley knows you are coming, and tonight the road through Mill Creek is half water." "Then I will wait here until morning." Wyatt's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low. "You can. I will not carry you off this porch. But by morning, that dress will be colder, the road will be worse, and the people inside will have spent one more night learning they can leave you there." The truth of that nearly bent her. She looked down at the mud gathering around her boots, at the shawl dripping from her elbows, at the satchel dark with rain. The door opened behind her just enough for Clayton's face to appear again. Warmth spilled out for a second, smelling of coffee and fried ham, then vanished as he leaned against the frame. "Calder, you have always had a weakness for lame calves and lost causes." Wyatt did not look away from Hannah. "She is neither." Clayton laughed under his breath. "You will bring her back before noon. She is no use to anyone. It's more than she earns and cries when asked to sign a simple paper." Hannah's cheeks burned hotter than the cold could cool. She did not turn around. If she saw the room behind him, the table, the chair that had been her mother's, she might forget how to stand. Wyatt finally lifted his eyes to Clayton. "A woman is not useless because her family failed to value her." Clayton's mouth tightened. "You do not know what you are taking on." "I am not taking anything. I am offering shelter." "She has a talent for making shelter expensive." Wyatt stepped one boot onto the lowest porch stair, not toward Hannah, but toward the door. "Then you should be relieved she is leaving." Clayton's face darkened, but Margaret's voice came from somewhere inside, calm and sharp. "Close the door, Clayton. Let Mr. Calder learn charity has a cost." The door shut again. The lock turned again. This time, the sound did not make Hannah flinch as hard, because Wyatt was still there in the rain, and the coat was still on the rail, waiting for her choice. He turned back to her. "My wagon is by the gate. You can sit in the back if you do not want to sit beside me. Calder Ranch is 7 miles north. Mrs. Ruth Bell keeps the house. She is old enough to scold me and decent enough to scold you if you track mud across her clean floor. There will be soup, a fire, and a room with a door you can lock from the inside." Hannah almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat and became nothing. "And what do you want?" she asked. Wyatt looked at her satchel, then at her face, not with pity, but with a solemnity that made her feel seen without being measured. "For tonight? I want you dry. Tomorrow, you can decide whether that was a mistake." The rain softened for a moment, as if even the storm wanted to hear her answer. Hannah reached for the coat on the rail. Wyatt stepped back before she touched it, giving her room. She wrapped it around herself, and the lining held the faint scent of leather, cedar smoke, and horse. It was too large, heavy on her shoulders, but warmth gathered beneath it like the first word of a language she had forgotten. She stood slowly, satchel clutched tight. As lightning flickered beyond the cottonwoods, the wet flap of the satchel shifted open. For one brief flash, she saw a strip of cream-colored paper caught in the torn lining, ink-blurred but visible in her mother's hand. Her breath stopped. Wyatt saw her freeze. "Miss Ellison?" Hannah closed the satchel quickly, pressing it to her middle. "Not here." Not with the locked door behind her and Clayton listening through the wood. "I will go to your ranch," she said. "But I keep this with me." Wyatt gave a single nod. "It is yours. And I decide when I leave." "Yes, ma'am." Hannah stepped off the porch into the rain, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because he had offered a door without first asking her to become smaller. Wyatt walked beside her through the mud, close enough to guide her through the dark, far enough that every step was still her own. The road to Calder Ranch ran 7 miles through rain-dark pasture, low pine, and mud that swallowed the wagon wheels nearly to the spokes. Hannah sat in the back with Wyatt's coat wrapped around her and the satchel locked beneath both arms, watching the Ellison house vanish behind black trees until even its lamplight was gone. She had thought leaving would feel like escape, but every turn of the wheels felt like stepping farther from the only home her mother had known, and closer to a place where she would owe kindness to strangers. Wyatt drove without filling the storm with questions. He only checked the horses, kept the wagon steady through the ruts, and once, when thunder shook the hills, slowed the team without looking back, as if he understood that sudden sounds could make a body remember what the mind tried to set aside. By the time Calder Ranch appeared, Hannah could see little more than a wide porch, a stone chimney, a barn roof shining wet in the dark, and one bright oil lamp burning in a front window. The lamp did something to her throat. It looked like a door that had not yet decided against her. Wyatt stopped near the porch and climbed down first, then moved away from the wagon rather than reaching for her. "Take your time," he said. "Mrs. Bell is likely already angry that I let the rain get ahead of me." The front door opened before Hannah could answer. A small older woman stood there with a shawl around her shoulders and a lantern in one hand, her gray hair braided tight, her eyes sharp enough to count lies from 10 feet away. "Wyatt Calder," she called. "If you brought the storm inside with your boots, I will make you scrub my floor at dawn." "Evening, Mrs. Bell," Wyatt said. "This is Miss Hannah Ellison. She needs a dry room and no questions she does not invite." Mrs. Bell looked at Hannah, not at the mud on her hem or the soaked bonnet sagging against her cheek, but at the way she held the satchel close. Something in the older woman's face softened without turning to pity. "Then bring yourself in, child. Soup is hot, and the kettle has not lost its manners." Hannah stepped down by herself. Her legs trembled when her boots touched the ground, but she did not fall. Inside, Calder Ranch smelled of wood smoke, coffee, wool blankets, and beeswax polish. It was larger than she expected, with a wide kitchen to the left, a sitting room with a plain fireplace, and a hallway leading toward the stairs. The house was not fancy. Nothing about it tried to impress. But it was clean, warm, and quiet in a way that felt watched over rather than empty. Mrs. Bell set a bowl of soup on the kitchen table and placed a towel beside it. "Eat first. Shiver later if you must." Hannah sat because her knees had become unreliable. Wyatt remained near the back door, hat in hand, rain dripping from his coat onto the mat. He did not sit at the table with her. He did not hover. He simply said, "The room upstairs is yours for tonight. If you choose to leave in the morning, I will hitch the wagon." Hannah looked up from the steam rising out of the bowl. "And if I do not? Then you do not." Mrs. Bell gave him a look. "You always did speak like a fence post." For the first time that night, Hannah nearly smiled. It frightened her how much that almost smile hurt. After she ate, Mrs. Bell led her upstairs to a small room under the eaves. There was a narrow bed with a blue quilt, a washstand, a chair, a dry nightdress folded at the foot of the bed, and a window that looked toward the barn. Wyatt stopped at the hallway, reached into his pocket, and placed a brass key on the small table outside the room rather than in her hand. "This key is for keeping fear out, not keeping you in," he said. "No one opens that door unless you say so." Hannah stared at the key. At the Ellison house, locks had belonged to the people with power. Here, a lock was being offered to her like bread. She picked it up slowly, waiting for the cost to appear. None did. Mrs. Bell touched the door frame. "I am across the hall if you need anything. If you do not need anything, I will assume you are sensible and let you sleep." Alone at last, Hannah closed the door and turned the key. The click was soft, but it moved through her like a prayer spoken in a language she did not yet trust. She stripped off the wet shawl, changed into the dry nightdress, and laid her satchel on the bed. Rain tapped the window. The room held still. No footsteps stopped outside. No voice demanded an answer. Hannah opened the satchel to hang her dress near the chair, and the torn lining caught her finger. She remembered the flash of cream paper on the porch. Carefully, she worked the seam apart. A folded letter slid free, damp at one corner, but sealed with the blue wax her mother had used for Christmas notes and church recipes. On the front, in handwriting that made Hannah's breath disappear, were the words, "For Hannah, when they tell her she owns nothing." She sat down hard on the bed, the letter trembling between her hands. For several minutes, she could not break the seal. If she opened it, she might learn that Margaret and Clayton had done more than cast her out. She might learn that the house behind the locked door had never been theirs to deny her. Outside, thunder rolled farther away. Downstairs, Wyatt's voice spoke softly to Mrs. Bell, then faded. No one came to hurry her. No one came to take the letter. Hannah held her mother's last secret against her chest and understood that the storm had not ended at the ranch door. It had followed her inside, hidden in ink. Morning came with the smell of wet pine, coffee, and bread warming near the stove. Hannah had slept less than 2 hours, not because anyone disturbed her, but because the letter lay on the chair all night like a second heartbeat in the room. She had not opened it. She had only watched the blue wax seal until dawn turned the window silver and the rain softened into a steady drip from the roof. When she finally unlocked the door, the hallway was empty. No one stood waiting to ask why she had slept so long or why she had not slept at all. The key remained in her hand, warm from her palm, and that small freedom gave her enough courage to go downstairs with the unopened letter tucked inside her satchel. Mrs. Ruth Bell was already in the kitchen, moving between stove and table with the authority of a general and the patience of a woman who knew grief needed breakfast before advice. Wyatt stood near the back door, sleeves rolled, speaking quietly to a ranch hand about a washed-out fence line. When Hannah entered, both men stopped, but neither stared. Wyatt's eyes went to her face only long enough to make sure she was standing steady, then moved away. "Morning, Miss Ellison," he said. The words were ordinary. That was what made them kind. Hannah looked at the table, at the flour sack, the bowl of eggs, the crock of butter, the stack of plates waiting beside Mrs. Bell. Her hands, restless from years of needing to prove her keep, folded together at her waist. "I can help." Mrs. Bell raised one gray eyebrow. "Can you cook?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you burn biscuits?" Hannah blinked. "I suppose anyone can." "Good. Then you are honest." Mrs. Bell pushed the flour toward her. "Wash your hands. If you ruin them, the men will survive. They have survived worse." Wyatt almost smiled, though it came and went so quickly Hannah might have imagined it. He started to step out, then paused. "You do not owe work for shelter." Hannah looked down at the flour, at her own soft hands, capable hands, hands that had mended sheets, kneaded dough, counted coins, and held back tears in places where tears were treated like inconvenience. "I know." Her voice was quiet, but firm. "But I need to remember I am useful because I choose to be, not because someone says I must earn a corner of the room." Wyatt nodded once, as if that answer deserved no correction. Then Mrs. Bell pays kitchen help 50 cents a day when she can bully them into staying. Mrs. Bell snorted. "I pay 50 cents when they are worth 50 cents. Then pay me after you decide," Hannah said. The older woman looked at her for a long moment, and approval softened the edges of her mouth. "That I can do." The morning unfolded in small tasks that steadied Hannah better than rest. She mixed biscuit dough, sliced potatoes, wiped the table, and learned where Mrs. Bell kept salt, coffee, and dried apples. The ranch hands came in shy at first, removing their hats and tracking less mud than men usually did when Mrs. Bell watched them. No one asked why Hannah had arrived in the storm. No one called her charity. When a young hand named Eli thanked her for the biscuits, she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. After breakfast, she noticed a tear in Wyatt's brown work shirt where it hung on a peg near the washroom. Without thinking, she asked Mrs. Bell for a needle. Wyatt saw the shirt in her lap an hour later and stopped in the kitchen doorway. "You do not have to mend that. It will tear wider if left. It is just a shirt." Hannah threaded the needle. Things become ruined that way. People see a small tear and decide it is not worth tending. Wyatt said nothing, but later that afternoon the loose porch board outside her room was repaired, and by supper an extra oil lamp had been placed in the hallway, burning low but steady. No one mentioned that she had paused at the dark stairwell that morning. No one asked why the sound of rain in the gutter made her shoulders tighten. The house simply adjusted around what it had noticed. That frightened Hannah in a new way. Cruelty was easy to understand. It announced itself, demanded obedience, left no room for guessing. Kindness moved quietly, and quiet things could slip past defenses. By evening, after Mrs. Bell paid her 50 cents and made a show of complaining that the biscuits were only barely respectable, Hannah took her satchel upstairs. The letter seemed heavier now, as if a day of being treated like a person had made the truth inside it harder to avoid. She sat on the bed, broke the blue wax seal, and unfolded her mother's handwriting with both hands. My dearest Hannah, if they are telling you that you own nothing, then they have already begun the lie I feared. The north pasture, the creek strip, and the old apple lot were placed in your name the year you turned 16. Your stepmother knows this. Clayton may know as well. Do not sign any paper you have not read. Do not believe love if it asks you to make yourself poor so others may feel secure. Hannah pressed one hand to her mouth, not to silence a sob, but to keep herself steady while the room shifted around her. Beneath the letter was a folded map, marked in her mother's careful hand, and a copy of a land deed bearing Hannah May Ellison's name. The storm outside had nearly stopped. Inside, a different storm began. She understood then why Margaret had wanted her gone before morning, why Clayton had mocked her over signing a simple paper, why the door had locked so quickly after the funeral. They had not cast her out because she had no worth. They had cast her out because she had more than they wanted her to know. Downstairs, Wyatt's boots crossed the kitchen. Hannah folded the deed with trembling care, held it against her chest, and whispered to the empty room, "Mama, what did they try to take from me?" Hannah did not bring the deed downstairs at once. She folded it along the same worn lines her mother had made, slid it back into the letter, and sat with both hands resting over the papers until the lamp beside her burned low. For years, Margaret's voice had shaped the borders of Hannah's life. Be grateful, be quiet, do not ask about accounts, do not trouble your father's memory, do not imagine yourself important enough to inherit anything worth naming. Now her mother's handwriting had drawn a different map. The north pasture, the creek strip, and the old apple lot were not scraps. They were the richest stretch of the Ellison place, the part with good water, sheltering cottonwoods, and the road access Clayton had always wanted for expanding the horse pens. Hannah understood then that the locked door had not been anger. It had been strategy. If she had spent one more night in that house, they would have pressed a paper under her hand before breakfast and called it family duty. She slept little again, but this time wakefulness did not feel empty. At dawn, she carried the letter, map, and deed to the kitchen, where Mrs. Bell was setting coffee on the stove and Wyatt stood near the window studying the washed-out yard. Hannah placed the papers on the table with such care that both of them turned silent. "My mother left me land," she said. Mrs. Bell wiped her hands on her apron and leaned closer. Wyatt did not touch the papers. "May I read them?" he asked. That question, simple as it was, nearly undid her. At the Ellison house, papers were taken from her before she could sound out the first line. Here, even proof needed her permission. She nodded. Wyatt read slowly, his brow tightening, but his expression remaining steady. Mrs. Bell read over his shoulder, muttering once under her breath when she saw Margaret's name in the margin of an old tax note. When Wyatt finished, he set the deed back exactly where Hannah had placed it. "This is not a keepsake," he said. "This is legal ground." Hannah looked toward the rain-washed window. "Then why would they tell me I own nothing?" Mrs. Bell's mouth hardened. "Because if a woman can be convinced she is empty-handed, she may sign away a full table." The words settled over the room. Wyatt looked at the map again. "The creek strip touches the south road. Anyone controlling it controls the easiest wagon access to the Ellison place." Hannah thought of Clayton's sneer, Margaret's cold patience, the locked door, the way they had called her useless, while fearing what she held. Shame began to loosen inside her, not gone, but unfastening. "They wanted me outside before I could read this." "Yes," Wyatt said. He did not soften the answer, and Hannah was grateful. Some truths were crueler when wrapped in comfort. The next days passed with the ranch slowly making room for her and Hannah slowly learning how to stand inside that room. She copied the deed in her own hand under Mrs. Bell's watchful eye, then helped mark the property lines on a cleaner map. She kept the original papers in her satchel, but no longer clutched it every time footsteps crossed the hall. Wyatt rode out each morning to mend storm damage, and each evening she saw small evidences of what he noticed. A stack of dry wood outside the kitchen door before rain returned, the hallway lamp trimmed and filled, a nail fixed where her skirt had caught near the pantry, the porch awning repaired so water no longer spilled, and a curtain over the steps. He never announced these things. That made them harder to distrust. One afternoon, when clouds gathered again over the western ridge and the smell of rain came sharp through the open kitchen window, Hannah froze with a bowl in her hands. Wyatt saw it from the doorway. He said nothing at first, only stepped outside and checked the porch roof he had repaired, then returned and set a second oil lamp on the kitchen table. "Storm will pass north," he said. "House will stay dry." Hannah set the bowl down carefully. "You speak as if you can make weather obey." No, his eyes moved toward the darkening hills. "I learned the hard way that I cannot." Mrs. Bell, who had been kneading dough, went very still. Wyatt took off his hat and turned it once in his hands. "My mother was caught out in weather like this when I was 20. I was driving cattle 10 miles west and thought I had time to finish the work before fetching her from town. The bridge washed out. By the time I reached her, she had spent the night in a shed with no fire, no blanket, and nobody thinking to open a door." His voice stayed even, but every word carried the weight of years. Hannah's fingers closed around the edge of the table. "Is that why you came back for me?" Wyatt looked at her then. "I came back because I saw a woman outside a lit house in the rain. My history only made sure I understood what I was seeing." Hannah felt the answer move through her slowly. He was not saving his mother through her. He was not making her into a ghost. He had seen Hannah as Hannah, cold and cast out, and that was enough. Before she could speak, hoofbeats sounded hard in the yard. A young rider from town pulled up near the porch, hat dripping, horse breathing steam in the damp air. Wyatt stepped outside, and Hannah followed to the doorway with the satchel pressed against her side. The rider held out a folded notice. "Mr. Calder, sheriff says you should know. Margaret Ellison filed a claim this morning. Says Miss Ellison stole family papers and that you are keeping her here against her will." The words struck the porch like fresh rain through a broken roof. Mrs. Bell came to stand behind Hannah. Wyatt read the notice once, then handed it to her without comment. Hannah saw the accusation in black ink and felt the old fear rise, but this time it met her mother's deed, the copied map, Mrs. Bell's witness, and Wyatt's steady silence. She looked toward the road leading back to Willow Creek, no longer only the road from which she had fled, but the road she would have to face. "They are trying to make the door I chose look like another lock," she said. Wyatt's gaze rested on her, calm and serious. "Then we show the sheriff where the lock really was." The notice brought the storm back before the clouds did. Hannah read the words twice, each line colder than rainwater. Stolen family papers, improper influence, suspected restraint at Calder Ranch. Margaret had turned shelter into suspicion with one careful hand. Clayton had helped lock a door and now wanted the law to believe Wyatt held the key. Hannah stood on the porch with the paper trembling between her fingers, but the tremble did not travel into her voice. "They know I found the deed." Mrs. Bell took the notice and made a sound low in her throat. "Of course they do. Liars always hurry once truth puts on its boots." Wyatt looked down the road toward Willow Creek. "The sheriff will have to answer the claim." "Then I will answer it first," Hannah said. She went inside, climbed the stairs, and returned with the satchel, the original letter, the deed, the map, and the copy she had made in her own hand. This time she did not hide them under clothing. She wrapped them in oilcloth, tied the bundle with twine, and placed it on the kitchen table where everyone could see. By late afternoon, another wagon came up the ranch road, wheels cutting through wet sand, followed by a deputy on horseback. Margaret Ellison sat straight-backed on the wagon bench in black mourning clothes, veil pinned neatly to her hat, her face arranged into sorrow so practiced it looked almost polished. Clayton sat beside her, jaw tight, eyes sliding toward the house as if the porch itself might accuse him. Deputy Samuel Briggs dismounted near the gate, uncomfortable before he even removed his hat. Wyatt stepped onto the porch but did not descend. Hannah stood in the doorway behind him, satchel in hand. Mrs. Bell came to her side with flowers still on her sleeve, a queen in an apron. Margaret looked at Hannah as if she had found a servant using the front parlor. "Hannah May, thank heaven. We have been worried sick." The words fell so false that even the horses seemed unimpressed. Hannah felt her fingers curl around the satchel strap. Wyatt turned slightly, not to speak for her, only to make sure she knew there was room beside him. She stepped out onto the porch. "You knew where I was." Margaret pressed a gloved hand to her chest. "We knew Mr. Calder had taken you here in a state of grief. That is not the same as knowing you were safe." Mrs. Bell snorted softly. Deputy Briggs cleared his throat. "Miss Ellison, your stepmother filed a complaint saying you removed documents from the Ellison house and have been kept at this ranch under pressure from Mr. Calder." Clayton leaned forward. She was upset after the funeral. She did not understand what she was doing. Hannah looked at him, remembering the warm light behind him when he told her to find somewhere dry. "I understood the rain well enough." His face colored. Margaret's expression sharpened, then softened again for the deputy. "My son spoke poorly that night, and I regret it. Grief makes a household clumsy. But Hannah has always been sensitive, and Mr. Calder is a stranger with an interest in land." Wyatt's joy tightened. The accusation struck exactly where Margaret aimed it, not at his temper, but at his honor. Hannah saw his hand close once at his side, then open. He would have defended her if she asked. He would also let her stand if she could. That was why she trusted him more than the people who shared her name. She crossed the porch to the small table where Wyatt mended tack and laid out the oilcloth. "Bundle. Deputy Briggs, these papers were not removed from the Ellison house. They were hidden in the lining of my satchel by my mother before she died." Margaret stepped forward. "That is nonsense. Then it will be easy to disprove." Hannah untied the twine. The paper edges lifted in the damp air. "This is my mother's letter. This is the land deed naming the owner of the north pasture, the creek strip, and the old apple lot. This is the map in her hand. This is my copy, made here at Calder Ranch in Mrs. Bell's presence." Deputy Briggs came closer, careful not to touch until Hannah nodded. Margaret's eyes moved over the papers, and for the first time since arriving, her mask slipped. It was not fear exactly. It was irritation at a lock that had failed. Clayton saw it and looked away. "Those documents belong with the family records," Margaret said. Hannah met her eyes. "If I own nothing, then why did you lock me out before I could read what Mama left me?" The yard went still. Even Deputy Briggs looked up from the papers. Margaret's face hardened beneath the veil. "You were not locked out. You left in a fit of temper." Mrs. Bell took one step forward. She arrived here soaked through, carrying a wet satchel, wearing a shawl that could not warm a scarecrow. "That was no fit of temper. That was a woman turned away." Clayton muttered, "We did not ask Calder to make a spectacle of it." Wyatt finally spoke, his voice low. "You made a spectacle when you put her outside a lit house in a storm." Deputy Briggs folded the notice slowly. "This matter concerns property and a complaint of unlawful restraint. It cannot be settled in a ranch yard." Margaret lifted her chin, recovering too quickly. "Then take her home where she belongs." Hannah picked up the deed before anyone else could move. "Home is not a word you get to use for a door you locked." The deputy looked from Hannah to Wyatt, then to Margaret. "Sheriff Rusk is calling a public hearing at the church hall tomorrow morning. Bring the original papers. Bring any account books related to the land. Until then, Miss Ellison remains where she states she wishes to remain." Margaret's mouth thinned. "And where's that?" Hannah held the satchel against her side, no longer as a shield, but as proof. "Here," she said. "Tonight, I remain here because I choose to." Wyatt did not smile, but something in his eyes warmed like the hallway lamp he kept burning for her. Margaret turned toward the wagon, her black skirt brushing the wet grass. Clayton followed, but not before glancing at the papers with a hunger Hannah finally recognized. As the wagon rolled away, Mrs. Bell exhaled hard. "Tomorrow will be ugly." Hannah watched the road until the wheels disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. "Good," she said softly. "Ugly things should be seen in daylight." The church hall smelled of wet wool, pine benches, and lamp oil when Hannah stepped inside the next morning with her satchel held at her side. Rain still tapped the windows, softer than the storm that had left her on the Ellison porch, but every sound of water against glass seemed to carry memory with it. Willow Creek had gathered early. Farmers stood along the walls in Sunday coats. Women sat with gloved hands folded over their skirts. Ranch hands from Calder Ranch took the back row, quiet and watchful. Mrs. Bell sat near the front as if she owned the pew and dared anyone to suggest otherwise. Wyatt Calder stood beside the center aisle, black Stetson in his hands, dark coat brushed clean, his expression calm enough to steady the room without demanding its attention. He did not stand beside Hannah at the table. He stood where she could see him if she needed to, and where no one could claim his shadow covered her voice. Margaret Ellison sat across from Hannah in mourning black, veil lifted just enough to show eyes bright with injured dignity. Clayton stood behind her chair, arms crossed, jaw set, looking less like a grieving son than a man waiting for a bad hand of cards to improve. Sheriff Rusk presided from a table near the pulpit, with Deputy Samuel Briggs beside him and Reverend Hale quietly watching from the far wall. This hearing concerns a complaint filed by Mrs. Margaret Ellison, the sheriff said, regarding alleged removal of family papers and alleged improper influence by Mr. Wyatt Calder over Miss Hannah May Ellison. It also concerns documents presented yesterday that appear to name Miss Ellison as owner of certain land attached to the Ellison property. Margaret rose before the sheriff finished arranging the papers. Sheriff, with respect, this should never have become public. My stepdaughter has been overcome since her mother's passing. She is impressionable, emotional, and easily persuaded by anyone who tells her what she wishes to hear. Hannah felt the old words settle around her like damp clothing. Impressionable, emotional, easily persuaded. Words made to turn a woman's pain into proof she could not be trusted. She placed her satchel on the table and kept her hands flat beside it. Margaret continued, voice smooth as church varnish. We took Hannah and his family. We fed her, clothed her, sheltered her, and asked only that she behave sensibly while the estate was settled. Then, during a night of grief, she left with papers that were not hers and went to a bachelor's ranch. A murmur moved through the hall. Wyatt's eyes did not leave Hannah's face. His stillness reminded her of the key upstairs, the hallway lamp, the coat laid on the porch rail instead of forced around her shoulders. Hannah stood. I did not leave because grief made me senseless, she said. Her voice sounded small at first, but it did not break. I was told I had no claim to the house. I was told I was a burden. The door was locked and my shawl was thrown onto the porch. Clayton shifted. Sheriff Rusk looked at him. Mr. Ellison, did you lock the door? Clayton looked to Margaret. She gave him a warning glance so quick that most would have missed it. Hannah did not. Clayton cleared his throat. The household was upset. I secured the house for the night. Mrs. Bell stood so abruptly the bench creaked. Secured it with a young woman outside in the rain. A few women in the hall whispered. Margaret's lips thinned. Mrs. Bell was not there. No, Mrs. Bell said. I was at Calder Ranch when the girl arrived soaked through, shaking, carrying everything she had in a wet satchel. I know the difference between a runaway and someone who had nowhere else to stand. Sheriff Rusk nodded for her to sit, then turned to Hannah. Miss Ellison, present the papers. Hannah untied the satchel flap. This time, her hands were steady. She laid out her mother's letter, the deed, the map, and the copy she had made under Mrs. Bell's eye. Sheriff Rusk read the first lines of the letter aloud, his voice filling the room with the words Hannah's mother had hidden for her. If they are telling you that you own nothing, then they have already begun the lie I feared. A hush fell so complete that Hannah heard rainwater slide down the window frame. The sheriff read the deed next. The north pasture, the creek strip, and the old apple lot were named clearly. Hannah May Ellison. Margaret stared at the table as if the ink itself had betrayed her. This deed must be reviewed by a judge, the sheriff said. But it bears a legal seal and witnesses. Reverend Hale stepped forward. I remember that signing. Mrs. Clara Ellison wanted Hannah protected. Clayton's face went pale. Margaret turned on him with a look that nearly snapped. Then she faced the room again, desperate to recover grace. Clara was ill when she made those arrangements. She did not understand what such a division would do to the family. Hannah lifted her chin. My mother understood exactly. That is why she hid the letter where you would not look. Margaret's voice sharpened. That land should have been mine. The words rang through the church hall before she could call them back. Clayton closed his eyes. Sheriff Rusk slowly lowered the paper in his hand. Every person in the room understood what had just been admitted. Hannah did not feel victory. She felt grief, clean and cutting. The woman who had smiled at her mother's funeral had not wanted peace, or family, or fairness. She had wanted land. Wyatt stepped forward one pace, not beside Hannah, only near enough that she could feel his steadiness across the aisle. The sheriff looked to Margaret. Mrs. Ellison, that statement will be noted. Margaret sat down, rigid with anger. Hannah looked at the faces in the hall, neighbors who had once nodded to her mother, women who had looked away from the Ellison porch, men who had nearly believed a locked-out daughter was a thief. She placed one hand over her mother's letter. I was not left in the rain because I had no worth, she said, clear enough for every bench to hear. I was left there because they were afraid I would learn it. No one spoke. The rain kept tapping the glass, but inside the church hall, the storm had finally changed direction. By the time Judge Abram Whitfield rode in from Helena 3 days later, the rain had stopped, but Willow Creek still felt washed raw. Mud dried in ridges along the wagon road, the church steps had been swept clean, and every person who entered the hall did so more quietly than before. No one had forgotten Margaret Ellison's words. That land should have been mine. They hung over the benches like smoke that refused to rise. Hannah sat at the front table with her mother's letter, the deed, the map, and Mrs. Bell's handwritten copy arranged in careful order. She wore the same brown calico dress, brushed clean, with her light brown hair pinned beneath a plain bonnet. Her satchel rested by her chair, no longer clutched to her body, though her fingers still brushed the strap now and then for courage. Wyatt stood near the side aisle, hat in hand, close enough for her to see but not close enough for anyone to say she leaned on him instead of truth. Judge Whitfield was a narrow man with silver spectacles and a voice that made even restless children sit still. He examined the seal on the deed, the witness marks, and the tax notes that Sheriff Rusk had gathered from the county clerk. He asked Reverend Hale whether he remembered Clara Ellison signing the document. The Reverend answered that he did. He asked Mrs. Bell whether Hannah had copied the deed at Calder Ranch and whether anyone pressured her to do so. Mrs. Bell looked directly at Margaret and said, the only pressure on that girl came from the people trying to make her believe she owned nothing. A few women lowered their eyes. Clayton shifted from one boot to the other behind Margaret's chair. Judge Whitfield turned to him. Mr. Ellison, did you tell Miss Ellison she had no claim to the property? Clayton swallowed. I repeated what I was told. By whom? Margaret's hand closed on the edge of the table. Clayton looked at her, then at the floor. By my mother. The judge wrote that down. Did you lock the door the night Miss Ellison left the property? Clayton's face reddened. I secured the house. Answer plainly. The church hall waited. Hannah felt her heart beat in her palms. Clayton's shoulders dropped. Yes, I locked it. Was Miss Ellison outside at the time? His voice thinned. Yes. Margaret stood. Your Honor, he was protecting the household during a difficult night. Hannah rose before the judge could call for order. She did not raise her voice because she no longer needed volume to be heard. He was not protecting the household. He was protecting a lie until morning. If I had gone back inside, they would have put another paper in front of me and called it duty. Judge Whitfield studied her for a long moment, then nodded for her to continue. Hannah placed one hand on her mother's letter. I was told I had no worth outside what they allowed me. I was told shelter made me obligated. I was told family had the right to decide what I could know. But my mother left me land, and more than that, she left me proof that I was not foolish for asking questions. She turned then, not only to Margaret and Clayton, but to the town. I was not abandoned because I was useless. I was abandoned because I was useful to them only while I did not know my own name was on the deed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of neighbors understanding too late what they had nearly helped bury. Judge Whitfield removed his spectacles. The deed is valid. Until final county filing is entered, Miss Hannah May Ellison retains recognized claim over the North Pasture, the Creek Strip, and the Old Apple Lot. Mrs. Ellison, you are ordered not to sell, mortgage, lease, or alter any portion of that land. The complaint of stolen papers is dismissed. The allegation that Mr. Calder restrained Miss Ellison against her will is without evidence. Margaret's face went pale beneath her veil. Clayton sat down hard, eyes fixed on his boots. Sheriff Rusk stepped beside Margaret with the account book Clayton had brought reluctantly that morning. Judge, there are entries here showing preparations for a transfer paper dated the morning after Miss Ellison was locked out. Judge Whitfield's mouth tightened. Then those records will remain with the sheriff pending review. Margaret's composure broke into something sharper. She would have wasted it. She does not understand land. Hannah looked at her calmly. Then I will learn. Wyatt moved then, one step into the open aisle. Every head turned. He did not look at Margaret. He looked at the town that had listened, doubted, watched, and finally heard. A door that shuts out an innocent woman is not a home, he said. His voice was low, but it reached the rafters. She will never be turned away from mine. Not because I claim her. Not because she owes me. Because a woman with the courage to stand in truth deserves a place where no one asks her to be smaller. Hannah felt the words settle beside her, not around her like a cage, but under her like ground. When the hearing ended, Judge Whitfield handed her the papers. Sheriff Rusk kept Margaret's account book, and Clayton walked out without meeting her eyes. Outside the church, the clouds had broken. Wyatt brought the wagon around, but did not open the door for her until she looked at him and nodded. On the seat lay a small envelope. Inside was enough money for stage fare to Helena, a note naming a respectable boarding house, and the copy of her deed. What is this? Hannah asked. Wyatt stood beside the wagon, rain-dark hat in hand. A choice. You can return to the Ellison land, go to Helena, stay in town, or come back to Calder Ranch. None of those roads require you to belong to anyone but yourself. Hannah looked down at the envelope, then toward the road leading back to the house that had locked her out, then toward the north road where Calder Ranch waited with a hallway lamp and a room key that belonged to her hand. She closed her fingers around the envelope. I will think on it, she said. Wyatt nodded. Then I will drive slowly. Hannah thought on Wyatt's envelope for 3 days, and during those 3 days Willow Creek changed around her in ways no storm ever could. Judge Whitfield filed the deed with the county clerk. Sheriff Rusk kept Margaret's account book as evidence, and the false complaint against Hannah was dismissed in writing where anyone could read it. The North Pasture, the Creek Strip, and the Old Apple Lot were confirmed under the name Hannah May Ellison, not as charity, not as permission, but as legal truth. Margaret was ordered to surrender every paper connected to the attempted transfer, and when the sheriff found a draft Clayton had prepared for Hannah to sign the morning after the funeral, the town finally understood why the door had been locked before dawn could bring questions. Margaret lost control of the Ellison estate accounts and was removed from the church charity board she had used to polish her reputation. Families who once invited her to supper began crossing the street with polite distance. Clayton, faced with the signed draft and his own testimony, admitted before Sheriff Rusk that he had locked Hannah outside and intended to pressure her into signing away the land. He was fined for filing a false statement, ordered to pay the legal costs, and forbidden from entering Hannah's portion of the property without written permission. He did not leave town in chains, but he lost what men like him fear most, the right to be believed simply because he spoke first. Margaret and Clayton remained in the Ellison house for a time, but its windows seemed dimmer after that. A home built on locked doors had no warmth left to sell. Hannah did not return to live there. She visited once with Sheriff Rusk, Mrs. Bell, and Wyatt waiting at the road. She took her mother's sewing box, the blue mixing bowl from the pantry, and a small framed photograph from the mantel. She did not take revenge. She took what love had left her and walked out through the front door while Margaret watched from the parlor without a word. On the fourth evening, Hannah stood outside the church hall after the final papers were signed, the stage fare envelope in one hand and the key to her room at Calder Ranch in the other. Wyatt stood near the hitching rail, his black Stetson in his hands, giving her the same patient distance he had given her from the first night. Mrs. Bell waited beside the wagon, pretending not to listen and clearly listening to every word. Hannah looked down the road toward Helena, then toward the north where Calder Ranch sat beyond 7 miles of pasture, porch light, and honest work. "I could go," she said. Wyatt nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I could sell the land, take the money, and start somewhere no one knows my name." "You could. And you would not stop me." His voice was steady. "Never." Hannah closed her fingers around the room key. "Then hear me say this where the town can hear it too. I am not staying because they left me outside. I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I am staying because your door opened without making me smaller. I choose Calder Ranch. I choose work I am paid for, a room I can lock, a table where my voice is not treated like noise, and the man who gave me choices before he asked for trust." Wyatt's face changed, not with triumph, but with the tenderness of a man receiving something sacred and knowing better than to grip it too tightly. He stepped forward only far enough for the people leaving the church to hear him. "Hannah May Ellison, I do not offer you shelter because you are weak. I choose you because you know the worth of a true home. I will not own you, hold you, or speak over you. If you walk beside me, it will be because you want the road, and I will count that choice as the greatest honor of my life." Mrs. Bell wiped her eye with the corner of her apron and blamed the dust, though the street was still damp. Reverend Hale bowed his head. Sheriff Rusk smiled once beneath his mustache. Hannah placed the stage envelope inside her satchel, not as an escape, but as proof she had been free to choose another road and had chosen this one. Wyatt helped her into the wagon only after she offered her hand. They did not marry that night because neither of them wanted love to look like rescue rushed into a vow. Through summer, Hannah learned her land acre by acre. She leased the north pasture fairly, kept the creek strip in her name, and planted young apple trees where her mother's map had marked the old lot. At Calder Ranch, she became more than a guest. She kept pantry accounts, helped Mrs. Bell run the kitchen, mended shirts for wages until she refused payment and became partner instead, and turned the small room under the eaves into a place of her own with her mother's blue bowl on the washstand and the brass key hanging by the bed. In winter, Wyatt asked for her hand at the kitchen table with Mrs. Bell pretending to count spoons 3 feet away. Hannah said yes after making him promise that the hallway lamp would always stay lit in storms for anyone who needed it. 1 year later, sunrise spilled gold across Calder Ranch, brightening the porch rails, the wet grass, and the new sign near the lane that read "Travelers may knock after dark." Hannah Calder stood on the porch in a soft green calico dress, wedding ring warm on her hand, light brown hair pinned beneath the morning sun. Her old satchel hung beside the door, no longer heavy with fear, now holding spare keys, clean handkerchiefs, and a small ledger for women who needed a room, a meal, or a night where no one asked them to explain their sorrow before offering soup. Inside, Mrs. Bell set biscuits on the table while 2 children from a stranded wagon giggled near the hearth, wrapped in dry quilts. Wyatt came up from the barn carrying firewood, his dark coat dusted with hay, his eyes soft when they found Hannah by the door. Behind them, the ranch house glowed with oil lamps though the sun was already rising, because Hannah liked the light kept ready. She looked out over the pasture, toward the road where she had once arrived soaked, unwanted, and carrying a secret stitched into her satchel. Now the door stood open behind her, not because she belonged to the house, but because she had helped teach the house what belonging meant. Wyatt set the firewood down and stood beside her without crowding. "Storm coming tonight," he said. Hannah touched the key at her waist and smiled toward the road. "Then we will leave the lamp burning."